They laughed at my frozen fingers until the Arctic team sent a flag. My name is Cassidy Moore. I am 38 years old. The morning Derek Holt laughed at my hands in front of a room full of trainees. I was holding a carabiner, demonstrating an anchor setup for low-temperature rope systems, and the laughter came not from something I said, but from something he noticed. He had walked into the back of the classroom unannounced, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to remind everyone that he could, and he stood there for a moment watching me work, and then he said it loud enough for all 16 people in that room to hear. He said, "Just make sure she can actually feel what she's clipping." There was a pause after he said it. The kind of pause that means everyone heard and nobody knows what to do with what they heard. Then a couple of the trainees laughed. The nervous kind, the kind people produce when they're afraid not laughing, will cost them something. And Derek smiled and turned and left. He did not look back. I stood at the front of the room with my slightly discolored fingers wrapped around a piece of equipment I had been using for 15 years, and I did not say anything for about 4 seconds. That was long enough. I set the carabiner down, I asked the trainee in the front row to pick up where I left off, and I walked to the break room and stood at the window and drank the worst coffee the center had to offer and thought about the Arctic. I thought about the cold. I thought about what the cold had taken from me and what it had given back. I did not know yet that in 4 hours, a package would arrive at the front desk with my name on it. I did not know it would contain a flag. I did not know that flag would carry the names of 7 people who were alive because of what I had put into 16-year-old students who were now grown adults working in one of the most unforgiving environments on the surface of the earth. I did not know any of that yet. I just stood there with my cold fingers wrapped around a hot paper cup and thought, again, about whether Derek Holt would eventually succeed in making me disappear. Cassidy had not always been afraid of that question. There was a version of herself that had never entertained it at all. That version had grown up in northern Minnesota, the kind of cold that does not announce itself but simply arrives, taking the warmth out of every room, every car engine, every set of human hands that forgot their gloves. She had grown up understanding that the cold was not the enemy. The enemy was the person who refused to learn from it. Her father had said that. He had been a volunteer search and rescue worker for 22 years in their county, and he had a habit of saying things once, clearly, and then never repeating them, trusting that you had heard and would carry them. She had carried that one. The cold is not the enemy. The person who won't learn from it is. She had carried it through high school, through her outdoor education degree, through her early years working as a wilderness guide for a company that took corporate groups on week-long leadership expeditions in the Boundary Waters. She had carried it when she applied, at 26, to join her first polar research support team as a field safety coordinator. She had been accepted. She had been the youngest person on that team by 11 years. She had been proud of that in the way that young people are proud of things before they understand what pride costs. The frostbite happened on the 43rd day of that expedition. She had been outside for 4.5 hours in conditions that were, technically, within the safety parameters she had helped establish. The wind had shifted. That was all it took. The wind shifted and came from a direction nobody had accounted for, and by the time she got back inside, she already knew something was wrong. You don't not know when it happens. There is a specific kind of wrongness to frostbitten skin that has no equivalent anywhere in ordinary life. It is not numbness exactly. It is the sudden, terrible absence of the sensation you depended on without knowing it. She had looked at her hands and understood what had happened, and she had done exactly what she was trained to do, which is to say she had not panicked, she had not gone back outside, she had documented the condition and begun rewarming procedures and reported her status to the team medic. She had done everything correctly. The damage was still permanent. That is the other thing the cold teaches you. Correct is not the same as unharmed. She had lost sensation in the very tips of her index and middle fingers on her left hand. Not total loss, but enough. Enough that fine motor tasks in extreme cold took twice the concentration they used to. Enough that 2 of her fingernails had grown back wrong, slightly ridged, the nail beds just slightly off from what they had been. Enough that when the expedition leader, a man named Gerald Pressfield, who had been doing polar work for 30 years and who spoke about his own body like it was a piece of equipment that had never once failed him, sat her down at the camp table and told her she would not be continuing with the team on the next phase of the expedition. She had sat there and looked at her hands and not argued. She had known, walking into that conversation, that arguing was not the point. Gerald Pressfield had made his decision the moment he saw her hands. She knew that. She also knew that in the 48 hours between her injury and that conversation, she had completed every task assigned to her without error, had maintained every safety protocol, had done every single thing she was there to do. She knew that too. Gerald had said she was a liability. She had said, yes, I understand, and had packed her gear and arranged her own transport back to the mainland. She had thought, on the long, cold flight home, about whether she would ever go back. Not to that expedition, to the field, to the kind of work that required your hands to function in the worst conditions the planet could produce. She had thought about it for a long time. She had thought about it through the weeks of medical follow-up appointments, through the occupational therapy sessions that taught her to compensate for what her fingers could no longer reliably feel, through the months of sitting in her apartment in Minneapolis and doing everything she could do with her hands just to know she still could. She had thought about going back, and eventually she had decided that the question was wrong. She did not need to go back. She needed to make sure other people were ready. And that, as it turned out, was something her hands could do perfectly. She had gotten her first instructing job at a regional outdoor training center in Wisconsin when she was 29. She had been running her own programming by the time she was 31. By 34, she was teaching cold weather survival to military personnel, to search and rescue teams, to wilderness medicine students, to Antarctic and Arctic support staff. She was good at it. She was better than good. She had a particular ability to find the exact moment when a student was about to give up and hold them in that moment long enough for them to discover they weren't actually done. She did not do this by being gentle. She did it by being honest. She would look at a trainee who was sitting in the snow with their arms crossed and their jaw set, and she would say, I know what's happening in your body right now. I know what your brain is telling you. I need you to hear me when I tell you that your brain is lying. And then she would wait. She would wait as long as it took. And almost always, eventually, the trainee would unfold their arms and get up and go again. That was the job. That was all the job had ever been. She had come to the center in Colorado 3 years ago because the programming director who ran it had offered her the chance to build a curriculum from scratch, and she had not been able to say no to that. She had built it. She had spent 8 months writing the course materials, designing the field exercises, sourcing the equipment, training the junior instructors who would assist her, and when the first cohort came through, she had spent 4 weeks watching them become people who could stay alive in conditions that would kill the unprepared. She had loved every minute of it. The programming director who hired her had retired after the first year. Derek Holt had been promoted into that position. That was when things changed. Derek was not cruel in the way that someone who knows they're being cruel is cruel. He was cruel in the specific way of a person who has convinced himself that his management style is rigor, that his skepticism is professionalism, that his discomfort with a woman who had more field experience than he did was just his natural commitment to quality control. He had been an outdoor instructor himself years ago. He had done some cold weather training. He had never been to the poles. He had, as far as Cassidy could tell, never been in a situation where the gap between what you knew and what was happening to your body was the only thing standing between you and a very quiet death. He had done the courses. He had the certifications. He had managed programs from behind a desk for long enough that he had begun to mistake the desk for the field. She had understood all of this within about 6 weeks of his promotion. She had also understood that explaining it to him would accomplish nothing. People who confuse a desk with a field are not amenable to that particular education. The first comment about her hands came about 4 months after he took the job. She had been in the equipment room doing a cold weather gear inventory, and he had come in and she had been checking the seams on a pair of insulated gloves, holding them close to her face because fine tactile inspection was harder with her fingers, and he had said, "Must be interesting doing gear checks when you can't fully feel the gear." She had looked up. He had been smiling. The kind of smile that has a second layer under the top layer, the one that says, I know exactly what I just did and I'm going to enjoy the moment before you decide how to respond. She had said, I checked them visually. Same result. And she had put the gloves down and walked past him and gone back to her office. She had thought, sitting at her desk afterward, that it was possible he didn't realize what he'd said. She had thought this for about 30 seconds and then stopped thinking it. It escalated in the way these things escalate, which is to say, slowly and then all at once. There were comments in faculty meetings about whether the curriculum was realistic given the instructor pool. There were informal conversations with other staff members that Priya had reported back to Cassidy, conversations in which Derek had apparently expressed concerns about whether Cassidy's personal history with cold injury made her the right face for a cold weather survival program. There was a time he had reviewed her student evaluations and pulled out the one negative evaluation from a trainee who had failed to complete the course and said, publicly, in front of 3 other instructors, maybe the issue is the teaching style and not the student. There was the formal complaint he had filed with the center's director in February, citing what he called Cassidy's emotional overinvestment with students, a complaint that had followed an afternoon when a trainee from a Coast Guard unit had been on the edge of quitting, and Cassidy had sat in the snow next to him for 45 minutes until he was ready to go again. The complaint said she had shown poor professional boundaries. The director had filed it without action, but not without asking her, privately, to be mindful of optics. She had said yes and gone home and called Priya and said some things that she would not have said in a professional setting. Priya Nair had been Cassidy's closest friend at the center since Cassidy's first week on the job. Priya taught land navigation and wilderness medicine, was 35 years old, was originally from Bangalore, had done her graduate work in emergency medicine at the University of Edinburgh, drank her coffee in volumes that should have been medically concerning, and had a habit of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the wrong moment that Cassidy had come to depend on completely. When Cassidy had called her in February after the complaint, Priya had listened to the whole story without interrupting, and then she had said, "He filed a complaint about you sitting in the snow with a student," and Cassidy had said yes. And Priya had said, "Derek Holt has never sat in the snow for anyone in his entire career." And Cassidy had said, "That's the point." And Priya had said, "I know, that's what I'm saying." And then she had said that Cassidy should come over and she would make dal and they would watch something stupid on television. And Cassidy had said yes, and they had done exactly that. And for one evening, it had been enough. The thing about a slow campaign of dismissal is that it works on you gradually, the way the cold works on an unprepared body. You don't notice it taking anything until you try to do something you used to be able to do and find you can't. Cassidy had begun to notice, somewhere around the beginning of spring, that she was spending time before faculty meetings thinking about what Derek might say and how she would respond. That was time she hadn't used to spend that way. She had begun to write more careful notes after every class session. The kind of documentation that exists primarily to defend yourself with later. She had begun to be slightly careful about how she corrected trainees in front of other staff, slightly more measured, slightly more aware of being watched. She had not been that careful before. She had not needed to be. What the cold takes from you is not always what you expect it to take. And what Derek Holt was taking from her was something she had not thought to guard because she had not realized it needed guarding. He was taking her certainty, the absolute baseline professional certainty that what she knew was enough, that what she could do was real, that the evidence of her own competence was sufficient to make the case for itself. He was taking that quietly, consistently, one comment at a time. Priya had noticed before Cassidy had. That was the loyal thing about Priya. She noticed things. In late April, she had brought Cassidy coffee at the end of a training day and had sat down in the equipment room while Cassidy was cleaning and sorting gear and had said, "You're starting to second-guess yourself in class." Cassidy had said she wasn't. Priya had said, "You checked with me 3 times yesterday whether a protocol I've never been asked about was in the curriculum." Cassidy had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "I know the curriculum." Priya had said, "I know you do. That's my point." They had sat there for a while. The equipment room had a particular smell, nylon and synthetic insulation, and the faint ghost of whatever everyone's gear had last been through. And Cassidy had found it grounding in a way she couldn't explain. And she had sat with it for a minute before she said, "He's talking to the director again. About the restructuring." Priya had said, "I know." And Cassidy had said, "He wants to move the cold weather instruction to a subcontracted model, external instructors on rotation." And Priya had said, which would eliminate your position as designed, and Cassidy had said yes, and they had sat there with the smell of nylon and old cold and thought about what that meant. The meeting was scheduled for the 3rd week of June. It was a faculty review, technically, a quarterly thing, but this one had an item on the agenda that was not typically on the agenda for quarterly reviews, which was a proposal from Derek Holt regarding the restructuring of the extreme environment programming. Cassidy had read the proposal when it was circulated. She had read it twice. It was carefully written, professionally formatted, full of the language of institutional efficiency and market competitiveness and sustainable staffing models. It did not mention her name once. It did not need to. Every sentence of it was about her, the way a whole is about the thing it used to contain. The morning before the meeting was the morning Derek came into her training session and made the joke about the carabiner. She had been running a cohort of fire department rescue technicians through cold weather rope systems, which was the first module of a week-long alpine rescue course. 16 people in that room, all of them experienced rescue professionals. all of them there because they had chosen to be there, because they understood that the mountains don't care about your certifications, and the only thing standing between a bad outcome and a worse one is preparation. She had been doing the anchor demonstration, her hands moving through the familiar sequence, and Derek had walked in and looked at her hands and said what he said and left. And she had held herself together for 4 seconds and then sent the class to work and gone to find the break room and the coffee. She had stood at that window for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she had looked at the clock when she walked in and again when she made herself walk out. 11 minutes is not a long time in any meaningful sense. It is long enough to decide some things. She had decided, standing there, that she was going to that meeting. She was going to sit in the room. She was going to listen to Derek's restructuring proposal, and she was going to let the director ask whatever questions she asked, and she was going to say what needed to be said, and if the director sided with Derek, she would deal with what came next when it came. She was not going to spend any more of her preparation for that meeting imagining Derek's responses and preemptively softening her own. She had spent enough months doing that. She was done with it. She poured the bad coffee into the sink, rinsed the cup, and went back to her class. She got the news about the package from Priya. It was just after 3 in the afternoon. Cassidy was at her desk writing up her session notes when her phone buzzed and she saw Priya's text, which said, "There's a package at the front desk with your name on it. Return address is something called the High Arctic Research Consortium." She had stared at that for a long moment. The High Arctic Research Consortium. She had heard of them. She had done a 1-week intensive with a group that was connected to them, maybe 4 years ago. A group of field support staff who were headed up to support a long-duration research station near 80 degrees north latitude. She had not stayed in contact with anyone from that group specifically. She had not expected to. The way things worked in her world was that you trained people, they went and did the thing they were trained for, and maybe you heard back from them and maybe you didn't. You did the job regardless. She had gone to the front desk and picked up the package. It was rectangular, padded, about the size of a shoebox. It had her name and the center's address on it. The return address was a P.O. box in Ottawa with the consortium's name printed in small letters underneath. She had carried it back to her office and set it on her desk and looked at it for a moment. She was not a person who made a ceremony of opening packages. She pulled the tape, opened the top, and looked inside. The flag was folded into a careful rectangle. The fabric, a particular shade of blue that she associated with official things. The kind of thing that gets framed or folded with deliberate hands. On top of it was an envelope. She picked up the envelope first. It was addressed to her in handwriting that was precise and slightly European in its letter forms, the kind of handwriting that comes from learning to write before everything was typed. She opened it and unfolded the letter. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, and it was from a woman named Dr. Signe Eriksson. Cassidy did not immediately recognize the name. She read the first paragraph and then she stopped and sat down because her legs had done that particular thing they do sometimes. When information arrives that is larger than your body was expecting. Dr. Eriksson was the lead researcher of the Station Nansen Arctic Research Team. She had been leading that team for 6 years. 14 months ago, in the middle of February, the station had lost primary and secondary power due to a series of cascading equipment failures during what the letter described as a sustained polar vortex event. Temperatures outside the station had reached 52 degrees below 0 Celsius, with wind speeds that pushed the effective temperature lower still. The power failure had lasted 72 hours. The station had emergency protocols, backup heating, contingency supplies. Those things had helped. But what the letter said, and what Cassidy read twice and then a third time to make sure she was reading correctly, was that what had mattered most during those 72 hours was not the equipment, it was the people. Specifically, it was what the people knew. What they knew about managing cold exposure and preventing tissue damage in themselves and each other. What they knew about conserving core temperature without adequate heating. What they knew about monitoring each other for the early signs of hypothermia, the particular symptoms that precede the ones that are obvious, the signs that are easy to dismiss as tiredness or irritability or confusion. That could be anything, but in this context could only be one thing. What they knew about staying functional, staying useful, staying alive when the systems designed to support your survival had failed. 7 people on the station crew had completed Cassidy's cold weather survival course. The others had either taken the abbreviated version, a 3-day module that a different organization ran, or had completed the consortium's own internal preparation program. During those 72 hours, the letter said, the 7 people who had done Cassidy's full course had led the team, not because they had been appointed to, because they knew what to do. because they had, as Signe Eriksson wrote, been trained by someone who did not let them pretend the cold was theoretical. Cassidy sat at her desk with that letter in her slightly damaged hands and did not say anything for a long time. There was no one in her office to say anything to. She sat there. She read the rest of the letter. Dr. Eriksson described specific things that had happened during those 72 hours. Specific decisions that had been made, specific moments when someone who had sat in Cassidy's classroom or knelt in her field exercises had drawn on exactly what they had learned there and applied it in conditions that were not simulated. She described a junior researcher named Marcus, who had recognized the first signs of mild hypothermia in himself at about the 36th hour and had immediately implemented the self-monitoring and rewarming protocols he had learned, had told the team what was happening, had not tried to push through it alone, and had stabilized within 4 hours. She described a woman named Yuki, who had organized the group's heat conservation rotation through the night hours using the buddy system protocol that Cassidy had built into the second week of her curriculum. She described what had happened at the 60-hour mark when morale had collapsed and everyone in the station had been somewhere between exhausted and frightened, and the decision-making process had almost failed, and she described how a field tech named Rodrigo had stood up in the main room of the station and said, "Our instructor told us this would happen. She told us our brains would tell us it was over before it was over. She told us that was a lie." He had said that, and the room had listened, and they had continued. The flag, Dr. Eriksson wrote, was the station's flag, the one that had hung at the entrance to the main research building for the duration of the team's current posting. It was the custom of the consortium to send the expedition flag to the person or organization most responsible for the team's ability to complete their mission. This year's flag was going to Cassidy Moore, whose name appeared on the letter of completion that 7 members of the Station Nansen team had framed and hung in the station's common room. Cassidy had not known they had done that. She had not known any of this. She had sent those 7 people back into the world with what she could give them and had not heard a word since. She set the letter down and picked up the flag. She unfolded it slowly. It was heavier than it looked. On the inside of one corner, in the same precise handwriting as the letter, were 7 names. Not the names of the researchers. The names were her trainees: Marcus Reeves, Yuki Tanaka, Rodrigo Alvarez, Petra Hulls, James Obi, Nadia Christofferson, and Thomas Mwangi. 7 names. 7 people who had sat in her classroom and her field and had done the work and had carried it into the Arctic with them and had used it to keep themselves and the people around them alive. Below the names, Dr. Eriksson had written one sentence. It said, "You were in that station with us." Cassidy sat with the flag in her hands for a long time. She was not a person who cried easily or often. She had learned in the particular way that her profession teaches these things to process emotion the way she processed cold exposure. Acknowledge it, don't dismiss it, don't let it run the room. She sat with what she was feeling and let it be what it was, without performing it or suppressing it. What she was feeling was something she did not have a clean word for. It was not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. It was something closer to the feeling of having been seen, of having something that you knew was real be confirmed as real by someone who had no reason to confirm it except that it was true. She was still sitting there when Priya knocked on her open office door and said, "Are you okay? You've been in here for an hour." And Cassidy said, "Come in." And Priya came in and looked at the flag and the letter on the desk and said, "What is that?" And Cassidy handed her the letter. She watched Priya read it. She watched Priya's face do the thing that Priya's face did when she was processing something that hit her harder than she expected, a kind of stillness, an absence of her usual expressiveness that meant the information was going somewhere deeper than the surface. Priya finished reading and set the letter down and looked at Cassidy and said, 7 people. Cassidy said, 7 people. Priya said, 72 hours. Cassidy said, yes. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Derek Holt made a joke about your hands this morning." And Cassidy said, "I know." And Priya said, "And then this arrived." And Cassidy said, "Yes." Priya picked up the letter again and read the last line again. She set it back down. She said, "What are you going to do with this?" And Cassidy said, "There's a meeting tomorrow." And Priya said, "I know there's a meeting tomorrow." Cassidy said, "I'm going to go to the meeting." Priya said, "With the letter." Cassidy said, "With the letter and the flag." And Priya sat down in the chair across from Cassidy's desk and said, "Okay, good." And then she said, "How are your hands?" And Cassidy held them up and said, "Cold, as usual." And Priya said, "Yeah, well, they kept 7 people alive." And Cassidy said, technically they taught 7 people how to keep themselves alive. And Priya said, don't do that. And Cassidy said, okay. And they sat together in the office while the afternoon light shifted and did not say anything else for a while, and it was enough. The meeting was at 10 o'clock the next morning. It was held in the center's main conference room, a room Cassidy had been in dozens of times, a room with a long table and windows that looked out at the mountains, and a whiteboard that always had something from the last meeting still faintly visible on it, no matter how thoroughly it had been erased. The director, whose name was Patricia Wren, sat at the head of the table. Patricia was 61 years old, had been directing the center for 9 years, had the particular quality of authority that comes from never having needed to perform it. She was not warm exactly, but she was fair, and in the specific ecology of working under administrative leadership, fair was worth more than warm. There were 6 other people at the table, 2 department heads and 4 senior staff, and Derek Holt, who sat 2 chairs to Patricia's left, with his proposal in a folder in front of him, and the expression of someone who had already run the meeting in his head and was satisfied with how it had gone. Cassidy sat across from Derek. She had brought the letter and the flag. She had not told anyone except Priya what was in them. She had the letter in a folder and the flag in the padded envelope, and she had set them on the table in front of her when she sat down, and Derek had glanced at them and looked away, and she had watched him look away, and she had felt something settle in her that she had been waiting some time for to settle. Patricia called the meeting to order. She went through the standard agenda items. She got to Derek's proposal at about 20 past 10. Derek presented it. He used the language from the written proposal, the language about efficiency and sustainability and rotation models and market competitiveness, and he did it with the fluency of someone who has rehearsed without appearing to rehearse, and it was a competent presentation. Cassidy had to give him that. He was good at it. He had been doing it for long enough. At the end, he said, I think we can serve our clients better with a model that doesn't concentrate our cold weather instruction in a single instructor whose own experience with cold injury could create questions about the program's credibility. He did not look at Cassidy when he said it. He looked at Patricia. He had practiced not looking at Cassidy, she thought. He had thought about the optics of that too. Patricia said, Cassidy, do you want to respond? And Cassidy said, yes. She opened her folder and took out the letter. She had thought about how to do this. She had thought about whether to read it aloud or summarize it, whether to be composed or whether to let some of what she had felt reading it come through, whether the right move was professional precision or something more honest than that. She had decided the night before, sitting at her kitchen table with the letter and the flag and a cup of tea that had gone cold, that the only right move was to say what was true. She said, 2 days ago, I received a letter from Dr. Signe Eriksson, the lead researcher of the Station Nansen Arctic research team. She said it steadily. She looked at Patricia. 14 months ago, that station lost primary and secondary power for 72 hours during a polar vortex event. Outside temperatures reached 52 degrees below 0 Celsius. 7 members of the crew had completed this center's cold weather survival program. Dr. Eriksson's letter describes in detail how those 7 people led the team's response. They recognized hypothermia symptoms in themselves and each other. They implemented heat conservation protocols. They maintained team cohesion and decision-making capacity over 3 days in conditions that were, by any objective measure, life-threatening. All 7 people came home. All 14 people on that station came home. The room was quiet. Derek had looked up from his folder. Cassidy said, Dr. Eriksson sent this as well. She lifted the padded envelope and took out the flag and set it on the table. She said, this is the station's expedition flag. The consortium sends it to the person or organization most responsible for the team's ability to complete their mission. She did not unfold it. She left it there on the table. She said, I am happy to share the full letter with anyone who would like to read it. I would also note that Dr. Eriksson has offered to speak with the director by video call at any time. I contacted her last night and she confirmed her availability. This last part was true. She had written to Dr. Eriksson the previous evening and received a response within 3 hours that said, simply, of course, tell me when. That was the kind of person Signe Eriksson was, Cassidy had thought. That was the kind of person the work produced, if the work was done right. The silence in the room lasted long enough to be a specific kind of silence. Patricia looked at the flag. She looked at Derek. She said, Derek, the proposal mentions concerns about the program's credibility. Were you aware of the station incident? Derek said, no. His voice was even. She would give him that too. He was a man who had learned to keep his voice even. She had not always been able to do that, and she recognized the skill. He said, I was not aware. He said it without adding anything to it, which told her something. A person who is aware of having just been contradicted by a flag from the Arctic either says too much or says very little. He said very little. Patricia said, "I'd like to see the letter." Cassidy passed it across the table. Patricia read it. Cassidy watched her read it the way she had watched Priya read it. The stillness. The going somewhere deeper. Patricia finished the letter and set it down and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Was there anything else you wanted to add, Cassidy?" And Cassidy said, "One thing." She said, "Derek's proposal talks about a single instructor's experience with cold injury as a source of credibility risk. I want to be clear about what that experience is. I have frostbite damage to my left hand from an expedition I completed in 2013. I completed the expedition. I completed every assigned task during that expedition. I have not had a cold injury since. My record in 15 years of cold weather instruction is available for review." She said, "I think there's a difference between an instructor who was injured in the field and an instructor who has never been in the field in those conditions. I think the people who come to us for training know the difference." She had said everything she meant to say. She stopped. The discussion that followed was not brief. There were questions from the other department heads. There was a period during which Patricia asked Derek to walk through the structural elements of his proposal in more detail, and during that walkthrough it emerged, as Cassidy had suspected it might, that the rotation model Derek was proposing would significantly reduce the total instructional hours available for the cold weather certification, reducing them from 140 hours to 80 hours over 6 weeks. One of the senior staff members, a man named Greg, who ran the wilderness medicine program and who had coexisted peacefully with Cassidy for 2 years on the basis of a shared commitment to not going to unnecessary meetings, said, "That's a 43% reduction." Derek said the remaining hours were sufficient for the course certification requirements. Greg said, "What's the certification standard based on?" Derek said it was based on industry benchmarks. Greg said, "The Station Nansen crew trained for 140 hours. That's the standard that just sent us a flag." Derek had said, "That's one data point." And Greg had said, "It's a data point from the Arctic." Cassidy had not smiled at that, though she had wanted to. She had kept her face composed the way she kept her face composed on the field when a trainee did something exactly right and she didn't want them to stop doing it to bask in the praise. She had learned that the moment you signal approval too visibly, the other person stops doing the thing and starts performing the thing. She had kept her face still and had watched the meeting continue. There was another thing that came out during the meeting that Cassidy had not known until it came out. Patricia had been doing some background reading in preparation for the quarterly review, and she had found, in the budget archives from 4 years prior, a proposal submitted by the programming department under the signature of the then director, recommending the elimination of the long-form cold weather certification in favor of an abbreviated module. The proposal had been rejected at that time. Patricia had brought the archive document with her to the meeting because she had wanted to understand the history of the decision. She put it on the table. The proposal from 4 years ago had been written by Derek Holt. He had been a department coordinator at that time, before his promotion. He had written a proposal recommending the reduction of the exact program that had trained the 7 people who received the flag. He had been advocating for the shorter model for 4 years. He had been wrong for 4 years. And if he had gotten his way 4 years ago, the Station Nansen team would have had 80 hours of preparation instead of 140, and Rodrigo would not have known to stand up in the main room and say what their instructor had told them about brains and lies. And there was no way to know what would have been different, but there was a flag on the table that represented a specific kind of knowing, and it was hard to set that aside. Derek did not respond to the archive proposal with anything that was visibly defensive. He said that his thinking on the matter had evolved. He said the current proposal was based on updated data. Patricia said, "I'd like to table the restructuring item for the next quarterly cycle and ask both parties to provide additional supporting documentation." It was not a victory in the formal sense, because nothing had been voted on, and nothing had been decided, and Derek was still Derek and would still be Derek in the next quarterly cycle and the one after that. Cassidy understood all of that. She also understood that there was a flag on the conference table from the Arctic, and that it was there because of what her hands had taught 7 people, and that the room had seen it, and that some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. She had said, afterward, in the parking lot, with Priya standing next to her truck, and the Colorado afternoon doing the specific thing Colorado afternoons do in June, which is to say being entirely too beautiful for the situation you're in, she had said, "He's going to try again." And Priya had said, "Yes." And she had said, the next quarterly cycle is 3 months. And Priya had said, yes. And she had said, I'm going to need to document everything between now and then. And Priya had said, we both are. And then she had said, can we also talk about the fact that an Arctic research station sent you their flag? And Cassidy had said, we can talk about it. And Priya had said, 7 people were in a station for 72 hours at 52 below, and they came home. And Cassidy had said, they did. And Priya had said, because of your hands. And Cassidy had said, because of what they learned. And Priya had said, Cassidy. And Cassidy had said, I know what you're saying. She had stood in the parking lot and looked at the mountains and said, my hands are still cold right now. Priya had looked at her. They're always cold. And Cassidy had said, yes. She had looked at her hands, the slight discoloration at the tips of her left index and middle fingers, the fingernails that had grown back wrong, 15 years of cold weather instruction in those hands, a flag from the Arctic that said, you were in that station with us. She said, they're still mine though. And Priya had said, they absolutely are. The following week, Dr. Signe Eriksson joined a call with the center's director at Cassidy's invitation. Cassidy had not been certain when she sent the second message to Dr. Eriksson, whether the researcher would want to be involved in what was essentially an institutional dispute at a training center in Colorado. She had written the message honestly, explaining that her position at the center was under review and that the station's letter had become relevant to that review, and that she understood completely if Dr. Eriksson's involvement needed to end with the flag and the letter. Dr. Eriksson had written back within 6 hours. She had said, I will be on whatever call you need. Give me a time that works and I will make it work. That was all she had said. Cassidy had read that message twice and then had sat back in her chair and had thought about the particular quality of a person who has been through something together with you, even though you were never in the same place, who has had the experience of depending on what you taught them and who has not forgotten whose teaching it was. The call had lasted 45 minutes. Patricia Wren had asked Dr. Eriksson to describe the station incident in her own words, and Dr. Eriksson had done so, without flinching, without minimizing, with the precision and directness of someone who has spent years writing grant applications and understood that you never gave an audience the summary when the detail was available. She had described the power failure. She had described the temperatures. She had described what it felt like to be the lead researcher and to understand, at about the 4-hour mark, that the systems designed to support your survival had failed and that what remained was the people. She had described watching Marcus handle his own early hypothermia signs. She had described the buddy rotation. She had described Rodrigo's speech. She had stopped at that point and been quiet for a second, and then she had said, I had been in the Antarctic for 3 years before this posting. I've been in cold research environments for 22 years. I have never seen a team respond the way this team responded. And I have been asking myself for 14 months, what was different? What I keep coming back to is that the 7 people who had done Cassidy's training knew something the others didn't. Not just the protocols, not just the procedures. They knew something about the relationship between your body and your mind in extreme cold that I have never seen taught the same way by anyone else. They knew that the moment your brain tells you it's over is not the moment it's over. They had practiced knowing that. You cannot know that from a textbook. You cannot know that from an 80-hour module. You know it because someone put you in the cold and stood there with you and waited. Patricia had thanked her. Dr. Eriksson had said, I want to say one more thing. Patricia had said, of course. Dr. Eriksson had said, Cassidy Moore got frostbite on a polar expedition. I know this because she told the 7 members of my team that story during their training. She told them exactly what happened. She told them she had done everything correctly and the damage happened anyway. She told them that the purpose of correct procedure is not to guarantee that nothing will happen to your body. It's to give your body the best possible chance. She told them that she had been dismissed from the expedition after her injury, despite completing her work without failure, and that the lesson she had drawn from that was not that the cold had beaten her, but that the people who defined her by her injury were wrong. Those 7 people carried that story into the Arctic. I know they carried it because 2 of them mentioned it to me independently during the crisis. What you do with an instructor like that is your business. But I wanted you to know that the call ended 2 minutes later. The restructuring proposal was formally withdrawn 8 days after that. Derek Holt sent an email to the faculty informing them that after additional review, the programming team had decided to maintain the current structure of the cold weather certification through the next annual cycle. The email did not mention the station Nansen team. It did not mention the flag. It did not say anything about hands or credibility or the gap between a desk and a field. It was 3 sentences long. Cassidy read it standing at her kitchen counter in the morning, and then she set her phone down and drank her coffee. The coffee was still hot. Her fingers were still cold, the way they always were first thing in the morning, the way they had been every morning for 15 years. She wrapped them around the mug and stood at her kitchen window and watched the mountains do the thing they do in the early Colorado mornings, which is to stand there being perfectly indifferent to everything that happens in their shadow. And she thought that she had always found that comforting. The mountains did not care whether you were validated or dismissed. They were just there. The cold was just there. Your job was to be ready. She went back to teaching. That was what she did. The next cohort came through 3 weeks later, a group of wildland firefighters who were cross-training for high-altitude cold-weather rescue operations. She stood in front of them on the first morning and looked at the 16 new faces and said what she always said at the beginning. She said, "My name is Cassidy Moore. I've been teaching cold-weather survival for 15 years. I'm going to spend the next 6 weeks making sure that if you are ever in a situation where your systems have failed and what remains is you and the people around you and what you will know enough." She paused and looked at them. "That is not a small thing I'm promising you. It's the biggest thing I know how to give anyone. I take it seriously. I expect you to take it seriously." She looked down at her hands, the slight discoloration, the slightly wrong fingernails, the 15 years of work in them. She said, "Any questions before we start?" There were none. There never were. Not right at the beginning. The questions came later, once they understood what they were inside of. She smiled. She said, "Good. Let's go." The flag hung in her office now, framed behind glass. Priya had been the one to buy the frame. She had shown up at Cassidy's house on a Saturday morning with the frame and a drill and the absolute certainty that they were going to do this properly, and Cassidy had tried to say that it didn't need to be framed, it was just a flag. And Priya had said, "It is not just a flag, and you know it's not just a flag, and the frame is already bought." And Cassidy had said, okay. They had hung it together, the two of them arguing for 15 minutes about height and alignment, and it had ended up centered on the wall behind Cassidy's desk at exactly the right height. You could read the 7 names without having to squint. You could read Signe Eriksson's handwriting in the corner. You were in that station with us. Cassidy had looked at it when it was up and had not said anything for a moment, and then had said, "Thank you." And Priya had said, "Don't be dramatic." And Cassidy had laughed, the real kind, and that had been that. Derek was still at the center. He ran the programming department. He and Cassidy passed each other in the hallway and said the professional things that people say in hallways, and he never mentioned her hands again, and she never mentioned the flag when talking to him, and they coexisted in the specific way that people coexist when they both know what has happened and have agreed by mutual silence not to keep happening it. She did not forgive him in the way the word forgiveness implies that you have let something go because it no longer costs you anything. She put it somewhere. She put it where she put other things that were true and that she had decided not to let run the room. She had heard from someone who was not Priya but who knew the department's history that Derek had lost a student to hypothermia 9 years ago, before he came to the center. A student who had been under his instruction during an outdoor program he had been running at the time, a college program, and the student had gotten into trouble during a solo section of the course and had not been found in time. And Derek had been cleared of negligence, but had never fully recovered from what the clearing said was not his fault. Cassidy had heard that and had sat with it for a while. She had thought about what it does to a person to have something like that in your history, to carry the question of whether you could have done more, to watch an instructor who had walked straight into the cold and come back, changed and kept going, and to experience that watching as a kind of accusation from someone who wasn't trying to accuse you of anything. She did not excuse him, but she understood him more than she had. And understanding is its own kind of release. The Station Nansen team published a paper the following spring about decision-making under extreme environmental stress. The paper was in a peer-reviewed emergency medicine and occupational health journal. Cassidy's curriculum was cited in the methods section, named as the training protocol used by the 7 field staff whose performance the paper described. She had a colleague send her the citation because the journal required institutional access and she did not have it. She had read the citation. She had read the abstract, she had set it next to the flag on her desk for one afternoon, and then she had put the paper in a filing folder and gotten back to work. The work was the thing. It had always been the thing, not the recognition. Though recognition, as it turned out, was not nothing. Not the flag. Though the flag was real and the names on it were real and the 72 hours those names represented were real in a way that nothing Derek Holt had ever said about her hands could touch, the work was the thing, the 16 people in the room, the thing her father had said once and never repeated. The cold is not the enemy. The person who won't learn from it is... She had learned from it. She was still learning from it. Every morning her fingers reminded her of what they had been through. The faintly wrong sensation, the cold that started at the tips and climbed, the adjustment she made automatically now, the way she held things, the way she checked her own work, the way she always knew where her gloves were. Every morning the reminder. Every morning the going on anyway. That is not what defeat looks like. That is what survival looks like when it becomes fluency. She had told her trainees, every cohort, the story of her frostbite. She had told them what she had done wrong, which was nothing. She had told them what the cold had done anyway, which was what the cold does when conditions turn. She had told them about the expedition leader who sent her home. She had told them what she had decided on that flight, though she had not known yet that she had decided it, which was that the dismissal was his conclusion about her and not the truth about her. She had told them that the work was to close the gap between what your brain reports and what is actually happening, to learn the specific lies your body tells you when it is frightened and cold, and to stop believing them long enough to do the next thing. She had told them this in the classroom. She had taken them outside and put them in the cold and stayed with them while they discovered what they could do when they stopped listening to the lies. She had stood in the snow with a Coast Guard technician for 45 minutes and waited. She had stood in the field in the dark with a wildland firefighter who was convinced he was done and said, "I know what's happening in your body right now," and waited while he figured out that he wasn't done and had not made a sound when he got up and went again. She would do that tomorrow. She would do it with the next cohort and the one after that. She would do it with her cold, slightly damaged, 15-year trained hands, and she would not hide them and she would not explain them unless someone asked. And sometimes someone asked, and when they did, she told them the truth, all of it, and then she said, "Now, let's go." What the cold takes, it sometimes converts. The wound becomes the map, the damage becomes the knowledge that the undamaged do not carry. What others call a flaw is sometimes just evidence of a life that demanded more than ordinary bodies are asked to give, and gave it anyway, and came back different, and went back out. The body remembers what it survived. That is not weakness wearing a brave face. That is proof.